I'll just pan across this series of Lincoln photographs. Not the first that's available, of course. What do you think of what we have today? The irony, of course, is that Lincoln's efforts created the context for Obama. What a tragic difference. Curtain bead from that experience. Comes to immortalize a legend. Interesting to see how different artists reflect what they felt about Lincoln. And this one almost cartoonish. Theoretically, the writing of the Gettysburg Address. While the log cabin plays a role in the mythology of Lincoln, apparently he was part of a family, the Thomas Lincoln family, that was in the highest 20% income level of his community or his area. They did live on the frontier, but they were not the pioneers at that point. An example of a log that's been finished off using these pretty rough tools. A log splitting mallet that we saw in one of the dioramas in the museum.
About Lincoln, and it takes him from his early days all the way up to his death.
Team Arrival?
Team Arrivals, Doris, Kearns, Goodwin.
This is the sinking spring site of Lincoln, earlier home, and there's another site about 10 miles away from here. But because both of those properties were under considerable land dispute, Thomas Lincoln abandoned this and moved westward. We're approaching the Lincoln Memorial here from the side, and we'll come around back. Apparently that was the site of the cabin. So this flat level part, if that were the topography at the time, would make sense. Lincoln has typified families who settled on the Kentucky frontier in the early 1800s. They built self-sufficient lives around the area's natural resources. Here they had to clear the land to raise vegetables, squash, and corn primarily. Used the trees to build and heat their home, hunted game, and raised their children, Sarah and Abraham. You never hear much about Sarah. Wonder what happened to his sister. The date in which President Theodore Roosevelt arrived to dedicate the construction and laid the cornerstone. It's interesting that there was, in an earlier museum today, a small piece of pottery that had a date on it that Thomas Lincoln, Abraham's father, had laid underneath the cornerstone of their small cabin. It also included a mule's shoe. And we'll go down below, of course, and take another look at this. So this is a typical authentic cabin, not the original cabin. It's interesting to know how they built the fireplace so that it didn't burn itself up. As it looks here, it was lined with stone. We know where the second floor was, but you can be sure that there was a loft in this building. Benefited from heat as well as the fact they already had a foundation. So this is the boundary oak that used to stand at this site not too long ago, as you can see. The marker is, and it was probably taken down after it died, but it was thought to have been started growing maybe 30 years before Abraham was born, and it was one of the standard classic ways that you marked off the boundary of real estate, mets and bounds. It's fun to realize that Abraham Lincoln lived, worked, frolicked, ran, hunted, hiked across these lands that we're looking at right now, that his slug trail is being crossed hopefully by mine. It almost necessarily has to be. Down there is the sinking spring that we'll go take a look at that justified homesteading this property, because it was year-round water that dripped into a lower cavern. And here we'll take a look at a diagram of it. This apparently is what we're looking at. Also known as Cave Spring and Rock Spring. Travelers often paused at this spring. Would hope the water in these fountains is from that spring, so I'll have some in case it is. It's fascinating. The water apparently comes out of there, drips down into this area. Wonder how they actually got access to the water. Did they climb down? Was there more of a pool down there? Interesting to think that Abraham Lincoln would have stood at this spot, maybe crawled down in there, cleaned out rocks, made the pool deeper if there was one, moved obstructions from inside that cave area. I don't know how far that goes. Maybe it just goes up there a few feet, but he would have gone in there for sure, and with a candle just to make sure he knew what was in there. Much of this rock work existed at their time, if any. Here we're looking at the monument from the front, of course. It has 56 steps, reflecting the number of years Lincoln lived. 56 years, that's it. This chestnut tree at one time apparently occupied most of Sinking Springs property. And of course, that's what Abraham Lincoln did the rail splitting on, because they're a long straight tree that apparently splits nicely on a plane. And the chestnuts were enjoyed apparently by animal and man. It's interesting in other parts of the world how roasted chestnuts are very much a snack that you can get from roadside vendors. A Nancy Lincoln Inn built and named in honor of, parentheses to capitalize for promotional purposes, on, close parentheses. And it was Knob Creek was the other site of Lincoln homesteading property, about 10 miles from here. This was the first memorial built to honor a president, apparently. Employees here said that Lincoln created the national currency,